Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Caio Borges from Conectas Human Rights. It's a pleasure to have you all here. I just learned that we have some other two competing events in the law school today, so I'm glad that some of you have made your time to come here. And in any case, I would like to say that this is also going to be a recorded event. So in any chance, we're gonna make very useful use of this discussion. So thank you very much first for all of you that attended, and then secondly, thankful my thanks to our fellow speakers here at this table. So today we're gonna be discussing the relationship between um, budget and human rights. It's a very interesting discussions. We don't have. I thought we didn't have any economists in the table, so I was just going to make a joke about, what can lawyers and journalists speak about budget and human rights. But then I just learned that Professor Andressa, she's doing her PhD in the School of Economics, so we have an expert here as well that even shielded us from criticism from economists. Her postdoc on economics. So we have an expert here, which is really interesting. I will moderate this debate. So I'm not gonna be talking a lot. I'd just like to make some introductory remarks. I'd like to also make a special thank you to Professor Philip Alston. Professor Philip Alston is here in São Paulo, invited to attend the International Human Rights Colloquium that is also happening throughout this week, and it's organized by Conectas with partners. It's our flagship event. It happens every 2 years. We bring to São Paulo almost 100 human rights activists, and Professor Philip Alston very generously accepted the invitation to come to the colloquium and also to be here today at the law school. And it was very interesting that just yesterday, Professor Alston participated in the debates at the colloquium, and many of the points he raised for the activists were exactly the need for human rights advocates to understand the economics and to understand some issues which at first might seem very difficult and not associated with human rights, like tax system, budget, fiscal law, all these very technical subjects that we could think that they are the exclusive domain of economics, but there is a growing recognition that there is a intimate relationship between these two areas. So I would just like again to say that this debate it is part of something that it was initiated last year in the midst of the debate of in Brazil about the approval of the budget ceiling that later became the constitutional amendment number 95. It was approved on December 13th, 2016. There was an intense debate in Brazilian society about this measure, this fiscal consolidation package. Many voices, many groups raised the potential impacts that this measure could have in social spending. But then, as I said, this is a theme that is mostly dominated by economists, so sometimes it's quite hard to establish a discussion when you have on the one side people bringing numbers, and on the other side some of us that are mostly bringing principles and values and counter arguments that are not necessarily based on numbers, although we also have numbers on our sides as well to make our arguments even more solid about the impacts that fiscal austerity measures they have on human rights. And Conectas partnered then with some leading institutions working on this: Oxfam Brasil, the Institute of Economic and Social Studies in Brasilia, and the Center for Economic and Social Rights. It's an institution based in New York. And what we did at that time, we realized that there was something missing from the debate. Although, again, it was very clear that Brazilian society was concerned about the effects that this measure could have on education, spending, health, budget. We thought that at that point there was no comprehensive debate about the human rights impact that this measure could have. So it was then our kind of entry point in the debate. We developed a critical analysis of this measure by bringing to the Brazilian debate the international standards that apply to fiscal austerity measures and political economic policies, broadly speaking. And at that time, we sent then this critical analysis to Professor Philip Alston, which happens to be the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. And drawing on these international standards, we argued that any fiscal measure should be tested against some standards. So international human rights law offers clear standards that can be used to evaluate the compatibility of domestic economic policies with international standards. And 5 of these standards were highlighted in this document, which are the fact that these measures have to be temporary, that they have to be proportional and necessary, that they have to be non-discriminatory, also that the government should look for alternatives for any measure that imposes less burden, especially on the most vulnerable, and also that these measures are preceded by meaningful consultation and participation of the affected groups. And then our conclusion, when we assessed the constitutional amendment, at that time proposed constitutional amendment number 55 with international human rights standards, we concluded that it did not pass those tests. And that's why we were calling for the government, for our parliament, to review the text of the constitutional amendment and not to approve it as it was. In the end, the measure was approved as originally proposed by the government. And something which was very important at that point was a statement issued by Professor Philip Alston in his capacity as the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. A very bold statement in which he said that that measure had no nuance and lacked all compassion. Professor Alston called the attention of the Brazilian authorities to the fact that that measure could be incompatible with the obligations set forth in the international treaties, conventions, norms that Brazil has signed in the field of human rights. And Professor Alston also pointed to the fact that this measure would have an immediate effect and would be most felt by the poor. That statement was really important because, as we all know, we are living a very delicate political situation in our country right now, where positions can be highly polarized. So it's quite difficult to achieve a middle ground and a nuanced debate where you can bring different perspectives and that these different perspectives can be taken into account by policymakers. So that statement was really important to kind of balance a little bit the competing views on the benefits and the cons, the pros and cons of approving a budget ceiling. So I would like, on behalf of Conectas and all the organizations that were working at that time in trying to bring these human rights perspectives to the debate, to Professor Philip Alston, for calling the government's attention to the potential incompatibility of the measure with international human rights. So this, I think I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to be speaking anymore. Just make questions for the rest of our time. I would like to yield the floor to Professor Alston for some initial remarks, and then after he concludes, I would like to make this as more of like a talk show, yes, to make some questions, to make it more dynamic, and even to have a conversation. We are not many here, so that makes even easier for us to have an authentic conversation instead of just, panelists transmitting knowledge to the audience. So I really would like to have this as a very informal conversation between us and also between us and the audience. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the debate.
All right. So thank you, Caio. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward more to the conversation than to my own remarks. First, let me say that I'm not in Brazil in my official capacity as Special Rapporteur, but rather as a participant in the Conectas colloquium, and in my capacity as a professor at NYU Law School. Second, we don't have time to go into this, but it's worth noting that Brazil is not alone in terms of a move to try to lock in what I would term neoliberal restrictions on public spending. The Economist magazine has an interesting lead story this week about the series of balanced budget amendments that have been adopted in different states in the United States, and the campaign to get that to the federal level, which is apparently quite close to succeeding, because they need to get 34 of the states to have adopted this in order to call a convention. So that would be a very significant move in the direction of, to use the phrase, constitutionalizing austerity. It's a particular irony for those of us who have worked on social rights and other matters. For many years we have been told that it's not appropriate to try to provide constitutional guarantees of social rights, because that would preempt the appropriate discretion of the Congress, of the elected parliaments, and therefore this is a matter that should be left to the voters and to the representatives in Parliament. Now what we see is the exact opposite of that. From the other direction, we are told that no, this is actually very appropriate to tie the hands of the elected representatives and no longer make it a matter for public debate and parliamentary decision. So there's a great irony in this movement. I don't want to speak for a long time this morning, and so what I have done is to prepare a statement which I will make available to the organizers, and which they can perhaps make publicly available at some stage later today. That will save me going over all of the individual points that I otherwise would like to make in this context. One of the, Caio mentioned before my concern that those who are involved in human rights need to become more economically literate and engaged. I don't pretend to be a sophisticated economist, although I have a basic economics degree from the University of Melbourne, which gives me some insight. But I do think that there is a risk that human rights proponents will find themselves completely marginal, standing in a corner talking about traditional human rights issues, about killings and torture and so on, which of course are important, but in the meantime the real action is elsewhere in the room, where fundamentally important economic decisions are being taken without significant human rights input. and those decisions then close the space which is available for any human rights advocacy for those who are sitting in the corner. So it's important for the human rights community not to leave themselves in that corner. They have to be in the room for the bigger debate. It was mentioned to me earlier that there is a proposal to cut the public security spending by over 50%. If something like that were to happen, it has absolutely dramatic consequences for the traditional human rights. In other words, so much of this debate is about social rights, social spending, but security has always been seen to be a fundamental obligation, responsibility of government. And I can think of no situation anywhere in the world where a cut of 50% would not lead to absolutely dramatic consequences, particularly for the non-rich. I won't even talk about the poorest, because we're talking here about clearly the majority of the citizenry. I have seen this in Guatemala, where the tax levels are so low that the government does not have money to spend on security. But it's not a problem, because people like me have our own private security. Everywhere you go, you have your bodyguards, you have your armored car. At home, you have guards, you have gated communities. It's fine. Security is good for the elite. But for the rest of the community, a cut of that magnitude risks a real break in the social contract, where the absolute minimum obligation upon a government is to ensure, to the extent it possibly can, the security of all citizens. So these are very major developments in human rights terms. So in the statement that I will circulate, I look at international human rights law. Brazil is a party to the international covenants, and I use in this setting the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. But as I said with my reference to spending on public security, it would be equally appropriate to make use of the other covenant. In other words, to be looking at this through the lens of civil and political rights, and not the more contested economic and social rights. In this statement, one of the things that I do is to try to get a better understanding of the position of the government. And I think this is a responsibility for NGOs, for the academic community, and for the media in Brazil, to ensure that the facts, as far as we know them, are available and brought to bear on this debate. In a statement that the government of Brazil has made to the United Nations office in Geneva quite recently, the government goes out of its way to say, for example, the new fiscal regime will tend to greatly benefit poor and vulnerable groups. It goes on to argue that the minimum floor for healthcare spending will rise and will actually be quite generous. Similarly, in the area of education, there is no spending cap. It then goes on and addresses an issue which I address very carefully in here, which is the degree of public debate. One of the arguments that I make is that a public policy of such magnitude, such vital importance to the entire society, needs to be very fully and carefully debated. The government seeks to establish that that happened. I won't read the whole statement, but this will give you a flavor. During this period, the debate over the reform mobilized the full attention of Brazilian society. It has been the subject of several television programs, news articles, and academic discussions. This is a 20-year freeze on spending, and the justification is that it's been the subject of several television programs, news articles, and academic discussions. What I haven't seen is any detailed economic analysis of the implications and any attempt to justify the program, both on its own merits and more particularly in terms of the alternatives. The government has said on a number of occasions that there was no alternative. There's no money, we can't raise taxes, and so the only possibility is this form of spending cut. That's not good enough to simply make that sort of assertion. There are many ways in which revenue can be raised, including actually collecting taxes, including cracking down on corruption, and a range of other measures. A government is obliged to show before it adopts what I would term draconian measures that it has given full consideration to other possible alternatives, the consequences of which are less dramatic for the human rights of the population. I think I'll leave it at that. I could, but as I said, because I'm making this analysis available, it's not useful, I think, for me to go through some of the more technical issues that I raise, but I'm trying to bring in some of the more recent literature from the International Monetary Fund and others on the actual fiscal effects of this sort of austerity, and the interpretation applied by the government is very difficult, I think, to justify in light of the great majority of economic analyses that have been made. I think, by way of conclusion, that policy making on the basis of an ideology of free marketism, neoliberalism, which is not subject to any detailed scrutiny in terms of its actual calculations and so on, is an extremely unsatisfactory basis on which to lock in dramatic reforms of this nature. So I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Alston. I'm looking forward to read your statement, and I'll make sure that anyone who has an interest in reading this statement, I'll make it to you, so we can pass a list perhaps, and then with emails, and then I can distribute it, disseminate it later. I'd like to apologize my fellow panelists for not having introduced them before we started, but I can do it now. Right next to me, to my left, we have Fernanda Papa. She's the head of programs, advocacy, and campaigns at Oxfam Brasil. To the left of Professor Alston is Professor Andressa Torquato. She's professor of law at the Federal Fluminense University, that's the translation, and she's also a postdoctorate student at the School of Economics of the Getúlio Vargas Foundation. And to my far left, Professor Gabriel Lochagin. He's professor of law at the Faculty of Law of the Ribeirão Preto Faculty of Law, which is also a campus of the University of São Paulo. Both of them, Professor Andressa and Professor Gabriel, also have their PhD from here, from the law school. And I would like to acknowledge and also express my gratitude, special gratitude to Gabriel for having so kindly accepted to host this event here at the law school with some short notice as well. So thank you very much for having arranging this space for us. We're very grateful for that. We have another participant which is not physically here, but Denise, that has sent a video. I'll be screening the video later, which is Denise Carreira. She works for Ação Educativa, an NGO that works with the right to education. She's also the special rapporteur for economic, social, and cultural rights of the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights platform in Brazil. She recorded a very interesting video for us about the monitoring of the impacts of the new fiscal regime. We will be showing this video. So I would like to initiate the conversation by going back to the basics, but not so basics, because we have here experts on the issue. But I'd like to invite Professor Gabriel to explain to us what is the new fiscal regime. So what does the measure say? And also, if you could explain to us, why was it proposed? What is the rationale behind this fiscal austerity measure here in Brazil?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I thank you, Caio and Conectas, for organizing this event with Professor Alston, which has been very present in Brazilian debate. I'm not sure he knows that exactly, but everybody discussed his opinion when the new fiscal rules regime was being discussed and published in our press. So it's our pleasure. I'm sure it honors the University of São Paulo to have this conversation here. First of all, your questions are not so basic at all, because the new fiscal regime has been introduced through our 5th constitutional amendment. Professor Alston might be impressed by the number of constitutional amendments we have. We're almost reaching the 100th mark, getting there. And the main idea was to control, or at least have some alternatives to the huge increase in public debt in relation to the GDP, to the Brazilian GDP. Our public finances are not in a very good state. Government is running short of money. Revenues have been directly affected by economic growth, by a severe decrease in economic growth. Public debt has increased in relation to the GDP, and public expenditures in Brazil have a historical tendency to grow. Yeah, they just grow since the Constitution of 1988. So the main idea was to control public debt levels through this specific factor. If we control public expenditures, we might affect the way our public debt is growing. This was the idea of the new fiscal regime. And we've done that by introducing fiscal rules. That's what we've been doing since the stabilization of our economy in the 90s. We have introduced many fiscal rules in Brazil, and some of them are still very important, like the fiscal responsibility law. The new fiscal regime, however, has some innovative aspects. It's a new kind of fiscal rule, especially because it aims at the long run. It has a very extensive period of validity. Although it's a transitory measure, it lasts for 20 years. And it's a kind of hard rule. Literature in public finance, and especially in finance law, distinguishes between soft fiscal rules and hard fiscal rules. The difference is not which one is more or less effective. Both of them can be effective in controlling public finance. But soft fiscal rules can be revised more often. Hard fiscal rules do not offer the possibility of revision. For example, the fiscal responsibility law has introduced many fiscal rules concerning fiscal targets, like budget surpluses, and these are soft rules in the sense that they can be revised from year to year. So each new fiscal year has a new fiscal target. It can be an effective measure to introduce surplus targets in our public finances. The difference is that the new fiscal regime introduces another layer of rules, which is a hard one, because they can be altered even by the parliament. So budgets cannot be adapted to circumstances. There is a very solid constraint to budgetary decision. Okay, this is the main idea. But what exactly does the new fiscal regime do? And I'm almost concluding. Just to explain, it aims at controlling primary expenditures. So it's not a ceiling to total public expenditures, but it's a cap to primary expenditures. What are primary expenditures? We can define it by exclusion. Primary expenditures are all expenditures which are not non-primary, which are not financial. So we can distinguish primary and financial expenditures basically. There's a part of the budget that is directed to servicing public debt, to paying interest rates at public debt, and that's what we call financial expenditures in the budget. If we exclude the expenditures in the budget that are spent with interest rates of the public debt, we are left with primary expenditures. So all the other expenditures which are not related to servicing public debt are primary expenditures. It's a very diversified group of expenditures. Current expenditures including payment of wages to public servants, pensions, social security benefits, unemployment benefits, education expenditures, health expenditures, investments, building roads, building new equipments, infrastructure, all those expenditures which are not concerned with the payment of interest rates in the public debt.
I'm gonna follow up now with you, still with you, and ask one question that was very, very highly debated last year, and it still is. How hard or rigid is the new fiscal regime as compared to other fiscal consolidation measures in other countries?
So the main idea was to control the levels of public debt. Yeah, so that's what I said. The point is, we're not discussing if the amendment will be effective to achieve this goal. So it may have very important side effects, which have been highlighted by Professor Alston, which should be the main topic of our discussion. People's lives will be affected through that. But the main point is that even from a fiscal point of view, even by having those effects in human rights, it won't control public expenditures. So the amendment is not functional to balance the budget by many aspects. Yeah. So I checked some numbers before coming to this event. So the numbers were published by economists Philip Alston and Monica de Bolle, and they estimate that more or less 51% of primary expenditures are constituted by entitlements or mandatory expenditures. That means they have to be spent. They cannot be cut. And besides that, they tend to grow. Pensions, they tend to grow because people grow old. That's a kind of natural tendency of those expenditures. So the point is that if we have a very rigid budget that cannot be allocated by discretionary will of budget authority, all those mandatory expenditures will reach very easily the expenditure ceiling and will expel all other discretionary expenditures spent in investments and social human rights, like the way the budget should be adjusted. So all those discretionary and socially very relevant expenditures will be the instrument of adjusting the budget to the new fiscal regime, because a great part of the other expenditures are just out of control. They tend to grow. So how effective will the new fiscal regime be? We don't know yet, but we are very sure that it won't deliver what it has promised. So there are many problems in the execution of this fiscal cap, because it depends on many other undercaps that are not included in the constitutional amendment. We should introduce limits to pensions. We should introduce limits to wages. We should introduce limits to hiring new public servants. And many of those expenditures are out of control. I'm very sure that although Social Security is very important indeed, no one's discussing that, but it should be reformed anyway in Brazil. It tends to grow intensely. If we do not do that, the fiscal gap will just be completely ineffective, and I'm afraid at some point before those 20 years have passed, it will cede to reality.
Professor, you'd like to make some comments on Gabriel's remarks?
It's just a question. I presume that the answer would be that the government is trying to set up an absolutely unavoidable need to carry out the sort of reforms that you're talking about.
Yes, sure. It kind of created this perfect environment, for discussing further reforms.
Okay, right.
Yes, true.
And it has acknowledged that?
No.
Okay.
Still on the technicalities of financial law, I'd like to make a question to Professor Andressa. Professor, Brazil has a rich history of attempts to control public spending. In your view, how effective have these measures, such as the one mentioned by Gabriel, the fiscal responsibility law, any other measures that have tried to tie a little bit the hands of public managers, policymakers? Does this work in our reality? And as Gabriel said, in your view, based on this historic and also based in your view of the measure itself, what is the potential of the new fiscal regime to become effective in our reality of not uncontrollable, but of peculiar relationship between budgetary spending and social spending and control of debt and all these other aspects that you understand much better than I do?
First, I'd like to thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. First, we need to have in mind that in our fiscal regime, there is a limit to for public debt in subnational government like states and municipalities, and until now we didn't have a limit for public debt in the central government, and that until now couldn't be applied. It's still on in the Congress, the enormous number of projects tending to create a limit for public debt in Brazil, but until now we don't have a limit for public debt for federal government. So we have called that is debate today the golden rule of public finance that is on our constitution, that nowadays newspaper are talking about, and because our finance minister Henrique Meirelles talking that we are in trouble to accomplish this golden rule for the next year. So there is I think from my view today's only limit that the central government has to create new public debt, and that impose a limit in the way that the central government just can do new debt in the amount of our spendings in investment each year. This is the what means the golden rule. So maybe the how Gabriel explained to us, this new fiscal regime came in order to create a kind of limit for uh, new expenditures, and in order to avoid the new public debt. So this is the message of the government, because our public debt is just increasing, and we don't have um, new revenues to face this. It's basically.
You said that you had questions to Professor Alston. I don't know if you'd like
Oh,
to
yeah,
make us
yeah,
these questions now.
yeah.
Feel free.
Thank you. I intend to use this space very briefly in order to make some questions to Professor Philip Alston. And in fact, some of my concerns and doubts from my part about the austerity policy that has been implemented in Brazil by the Brazilian government. The first one concerning to social spendings in education and healthcare. Um, One of the government arguments about the inefficiency we have with expenditure on education and healthcare comes in part from the obligation imposed by our constitution to spend a minimal percentage of our current revenue on these fields, about 15% on healthcare and 18% of our tax revenue on education at the federal level. According to our finance minister Henrique Meirelles, this generates inefficiency, considering that we have important variation on the amount of revenue raised each year. So, and when the revenue raised increases strongly from one year to another, and the government is forced to apply this minimal fixed percentage of the revenue on education and healthcare, this has generated inefficiency on the use of this revenue, because the government is not well prepared to use this amount that in the end will just be used, this amount, because it's there and we have the obligation to spend. Then according to him, the finance minister Henrique Meirelles would be more efficient if we could plan our public policy on these fields, education and healthcare, according to the economic growth of the country, in order to develop more sustainable policies at the long run and avoid to contract new debts. This is one of the justifications for the amendment, and how healthcare and education was treated by the amendment, constitutional amendment. And another question, I'm using this space just to have some, to get some of your experience, Professor. Another question deals with what we call the ceiling for public expenditure imposed in Brazil, in comparing what were imposed, for example, in Netherlands, that were an example that the government used to justify our a ceiling for public expenditure in Brazil, that had good results with this austerity policy. But the point of my question is that in Netherlands were imposed also a limit to spend on the payments of interest of public debt. And I would like to ask if the absence of this kind of limitation, the payment of interest in Brazil, make our constitutional amendment like more problematic.
Really interesting this question. So, and they were all again discussed last year. Many groups were raising, just going to the second questions about why does this new fiscal regime does not also impose a limit on interest repayment, repayment of the debt. That was the second question. And then your first question, which is also very much interesting, is like ceilings are a good idea, but floors are not good idea. Like don't set a minimum floor for spending on social social areas. This is not good. This leads to inefficiency. Yes, these are very interesting questions. So Professor Alston.
Just add something before the answer. Something very quickly. In Brazil, floors tend to become ceilings very easily. They just spend the minimum as the mandatory expenditure and nothing else.
Also to include to Professor's answer, if you're going into other countries' experiences, as you mentioned, Netherlands, how about the other countries' experiences that you've been following? Don't all the countries, or many of the countries, including the most developed ones, have debts in their balances, in their accounts? I mean, it's normal to have a debt when it comes to social investment, isn't it? I mean, so the idea here is that's very much spread in the media is that we have to hold our debt. It's going deeper and deeper, and it's been the biggest ever, and so on and so forth. However, it's part of the game about fighting inequality to have more social spending. So the experience in other countries, how do you see that, if it's possible to include?
Well, I'm not sure that I have a lot of answers to very difficult questions. First of all, of course, public debt is a standard feature of the budgets of most governments, but that's a complex issue as well. I think what is different, though, as you well know, about the Brazilian situation is just this, first of all, the time period. To tie hands for 20 years seems to be quite extraordinary, and to be highly inconsistent with the critique leveled at the 1988 Constitution, which is precisely that it included specific percentages which tied the hands. I must say that I haven't seen many examples where these set percentages work in any effective way. One that comes to mind is Indonesia, which has such a percentage. It's much lower, written into the constitution, but the government simply suspends the constitution, that particular provision, every year. And so I don't know that that is the solution, but that just highlights the irony, as you've already pointed out, of combating one fixed percentage which removes flexibility with another fixed percentage which imposes a different type of rigidity, and I think neither of those is an appropriate way to go. I think the example of the Netherlands in terms of limits on debt payments really just serves to illustrate that there cannot be a wholly one-sided approach to such a complex set of challenges, and that is what this constitutional amendment seems to represent, rather than that my point about the need to undertake studies to look at the various ways in which alternative sources of revenues can be raised or alternative expenditure cuts can be made is a crucial part of that demonstration that all options have been looked at and what comes out is a balanced approach. But that's not what is being advocated generally by neoliberal economists who see the problem all on one particular side and tend to make all sorts of assumptions about the levels of foreign direct investment inflow and the other benefits that will automatically result in the curtailment of public social expenditures.
Thank you very much. Before we move, I'd like now to go to the main topic of this debate, which is the relationship between the new fiscal regime and any austerity measure and human rights. But I'd like to open to the floor to the audience. Do any of you have any questions so far about what we've discussed? Yes, we have a question in the back. Please, could you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Talita, and I work for the State Parliament, Ação Educativa. So my question is specifically, Brazil is, and I'd like to hear from Professor, what, in comparison to other countries, what have you seen when we're talking about federalist states? So what I mean is that in Brazil, the public spending towards education and health also comes from the states and from what would be the municipalities or the counties or the states or the cities. And that also comes from their budget and from the budget of the states. And what I see, especially here in the state of São Paulo, is that when they're discussing budget and the budget law, a lei orçamentária, this doesn't even come into question when they are debating whether they're going to take money from this specific investment towards another investment. That doesn't even come into question when they're debating the state budget and the state budget law budget. So my question is, in other countries, is there a mandatory analysis by the legislative towards how the changes impact in human rights accomplishments or not? I don't know if I was clear.
I'm glad you introduced your next subject. So yes, that's a good way to start, of course. So please, Professor.
First of all, as I'm sure you know, one of the most complex issues, of course, are issues relating to federalism. So the systems in Australia, United States, Canada, Nigeria, Germany, any other federal system are all very different and very complex, because that's the classic result of very detailed negotiations between the different levels to work out the mechanisms. So it's very hard to make meaningful comparisons with the very specific system that you have evolved here in Brazil versus that of other countries. The two systems that I know best, which are Australia, where I'm from, and the United States, where I live, have a much less integrated system for municipal, local, national, state and federal spending than Brazil does. And so they don't get into this complication, although you suggest that it doesn't actually lead to the sort of rational, consultative decision-making that one would expect in those circumstances. The other part of your question related to the experience of other states in trying to undertake some form of evaluation, or what is often called human rights impact assessment. There are not a lot of good practices in that regard. A government like Canada does have for example, I forget what they call it. It's not a women's budget, but it is effectively the need to report on the extent to which the budget has an impact on women and on women's rights. And I think that can be important, but as with provisions for, as they have in the United States, the General Accountability Office, as it's now called, or the Government Accountability Office, it used to be the General Accounting Office, which does independent assessments of budgetary and other issues. The real challenge there is the extent to which the legislature then takes those inputs into account. And that's also true in the human rights area, to the extent that you have, whether it's parliamentary committees or independent committees or national human rights institutions doing any form of budgetary analysis. It can be meaningful if a government takes it seriously, or it can be tokenism, which really doesn't achieve anything.
Thank you very much. And also, just mention that it can be quite a presumptuous answer, but I think that in the public debate about the constitutional amendment, the first time that it was raised, the issue of human rights impact assessment, was exactly when the four organizations did the analysis, like a human rights based assessment of the new fiscal regime. Of course, that there were some groups calling for impact assessment on right to education or to health, but as a comprehensive issue drawing from these international human rights standards, I think we brought that to the public debate here in Brazil. And just to say that the lack of impact assessment is not just a matter that would contaminate this new fiscal regime. I think it's endemic to any policy here in this country, in Brazil. I don't know if my fellow colleagues would agree with that. We don't really have a culture of making impact assessment of economic or social policies. Anyway, I've heard that the first impact assessment that was made before a policy was enacted in Brazil was the Bolsa Família, the cash condition transfer system, as a condition by the World Bank to give support to that program. I don't know if that's true, but I've heard that in another debate. So now, again, going more explicitly into this relationship between human rights and austerity, but also adding another element which is very important, which is inequality. I'd like to invite Fernanda to talk about the recently launched report by Oxfam Brasil, the distance that unites us. Yes, a picture, an overview of the Brazilian inequalities. And this report was just launched last week, and it gained very high media attention because of the staggering numbers that this report brought. So if I'm not wrong, one of the findings was that 5 or 6 persons own the same wealth as they have 100 million Brazilians. So it's a very astonishing number. And as I went through this document, which I recommend you all to read, one thing that it caught my attention is that you're dealing with inequality, but you bring into the debate many aspects. So inequality as a multi-dimensional issue that includes the tax system, how the tax system reinforces inequality patterns, the role of public spending, but also discrimination, education policies. So, I mean, of course, that I'd like you to of course take your time and introduce us to this report. But also, if you could stress a little bit how public spending and austerity have an impact on inequality.
Thank you, Caio. Thank you, professors that are present here. I'm learning a lot. I am not a professor. And coming from the CSO's background, also as following the recommendation of Professor Alston, we are trying to become less ignorant about taxation, about fiscal systems, in a way that we can influence budget decisions, so then they can benefit the less privileged in our societies, the most vulnerable groups, and also, at the end of the day, to guarantee social rights. So when you're talking about the fight against inequality, tackling inequality in our countries, and this is basically what Oxfam Brasil, for the past nearly 2 years, only 2 years old organization in the country, because it's now a Brazilian NGO in the Confederation of Oxfam. It's really about discussing the roots of injustice in our country. So inequalities and social spending have everything to do with each other, right? So even though we are coming from the past 15 years of better inclusion, better social inclusion, we've coming from a virtual cycle of lifting 28 million out of poverty, reducing a bit of our inequality rates. When we look at the Gini coefficient, we are coming from, it used to be 0.623 and it's now 0.51, I think. So social spending has a lot to do with the decrease of the Gini in Brazil, for example. So if you look at the universalization of basic schooling, for example, this is one of the reasons why Gini has decreased, right? The rates of inequality in the country. So it's a combination, right, of economic stability, the low inflation that we had in those years, beginning of the years 2000, the real growth of the minimum wage, which is something that's very relevant that we discuss in the report as well. More formalization in the labor world, which means also the guarantee of the decent work right. So we're always talking about human rights here, and the expansion of essential services and the cash transfer programs. They have been responsible for the good moment that Brazil went through, and we have faced the possibility of being out of the hunger map for the first time in our history, and those achievements that are now threatened by not only the new fiscal regime, but from the austerity policies that started to be implemented since in the year 2015. So we must go back a little bit in time, which is nearly 2 years ago, with the second term of President Dilma, when austerity policies came to the table in a way that our budgets were really starting to be cut. So the PEC da Morte, as some social movements were calling it, which they were calling it the amendment of the death, because it can really result in the uncoverage of a lot of the social services that had been provided and have been provided up to now. So when we look at the budget for next year, it's really scary. It's really astonishing what we see for next year and already for this year, right? So the report draws attention to this. One of the asks that we have in this report is really about a more fair tax system that can look at the super rich and bring new layers of tax income in a way that we can increase the public revenue coming from taxes, and have this higher revenue be invested to social services in order to fight inequalities, and not freezing something and taking away from those who are in more need when it comes to social investments. So it's a way, one of the asks that we bring is to look at our not fair at all fiscal system and tax system that need to favor the poor and not only perpetrate the privilege of the elite in Brazil. So we need to increase taxation for those who make more, and this is something that's sort of out of the agenda. Minister of Finance a couple months ago, they even mentioned, it was one afternoon, they said that the Minister of Finance was studying the creation of a new layer up to 35% of income for those who have wages that are over 20,000 reais. This was maybe 4 p.m. in the afternoon that somebody brought the line somewhere. 7 p.m. Presidential Palace calls for a media. They had an announcement to make that market, don't worry, we're not going to consider that. So this was something out of their minds, but it's not going to be approved. At the same time, President of the lower house, Rodrigo Maia, said, if this thing ever comes around, it's not going to be voted at all. So it was a matter of a couple hours. It wasn't even, and this is a whole debate that's been out in this country and out of this country for a long time. So this is one of the asks that we are trying to bring with this. It's a very, I wouldn't say informal, but it's not academic. It's just a simple text that brings evidence-based figures and numbers just to discuss with a broader audience, ages, in different parts of the society, what's the importance of fighting the structural reasons of causes of inequality in Brazil. So we believe that we need to have emphasis on the unfair tax system, in the insufficient investments in social policies, also looking at the educational deficits, and also talking about racism and gender discriminations, which prevent the Black population and women to reach equality to white male and to the upper classes in terms of quality of education, quality of their jobs, and of course dignity in their lives. And this is all also related to serious human rights violations that we witness at the moment, such as the genocide of our Black youngsters. We have 30,000 young people under 30 being killed in Brazil every year. 75% of those casualties are Black youngsters. And Brazil is reaching like 60,000 homicides per year, which is more than civil war, at its extreme. So we're talking about having less investments to policies that could address and fight those problems. Also talking about violence against women, and also talking about education, essential services, sanitation, public transportation, you name it. Everything that we are now going back to, that we were trying to have better public policies, are now at risk because of the 20 years freeze. So basically the report is addressing this. We know that social spending has proven to be an effective way out of inequality in many countries, as it was being introduced and experienced by the Brazilian society. So it's with the highest concerns, and in the report it states that we need the revision of this amendment. We need the new fiscal regime to be reviewed. It says that in 10 years' time it's going to be reviewed. It's in the law, but we probably need this in a shorter time. So this is what the report is basically talking about when it comes to the subject that we're addressing here. And then I think we can go on and also talk about, we have one recent study. I don't have the final findings of it, but we're carrying it out along with UNESCO and with the CSR, which is the other organization that is also our partner in reaching out to Philip Alston to discuss the issue of the amendment of the Constitution through the United Nations bodies, and also to approach the Brazilian state against it. And we are now looking at the budget in the policy to prevent violence against women. It's had a cut of 53% of its small budget already, because it's a very new policy. It's only a 10 years old policy. So but the policy to the rights of youth has been the one that has the highest cut. Number one, if we look at the policies, we were looking at the budget for 2017 compared in the years back since 2014, how it's been decreased. And out of the 30 pastas, 30 organs, 30 departments in the government that have had cuts since last year, or since 15, I would say, because again, we have to look at since the year 15 when the cuts started. out of those 30, 18 are directly related to the human rights field. That's recent public policies in terms of the presidency and of the Brazilian federal government. We're talking about policies for the youth, for women, for the equality of races, for children and adolescents, for the protection of human rights defenders. We're talking about policies to control for the environment. So all of those human rights, socioeconomic and environment human rights, the last generation of rights are being threatened directly by the amendment and by the current fiscal policies in the country. So this is something that's really drawing our attention and is really of high concern that we are now discussing inequality as a key to discuss human rights in the daily lives. So as the professor said in the beginning, we're still against torture, we're still against civil rights violations, and those are also under threat. We could go into that when we talk about the police control of public manifestation in this country and how violence has increased over the past recent times. But we're talking about human rights in the daily life. So it's really about having the majority of the population not being able to achieve their basic rights because the state is not coming and delivering what it's supposed to deliver. So it's really about dignity of the people, right? It's really about denying dignity for those who are going to be uncovered by the cuts in the budget.
Fantastic, Fernanda. Thank you very much. And in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned all this debate about the tax justice, yes, and how we could enact reforms in our tax system to make it more fair than it is right now. And that legal memo, I'm always bringing it back because it kind of concentrated the arguments we had at that time, pointed to the potential harm that this measure could do. We also used data from the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, that said if we reinstated one tax that does not exist anymore in Brazil, which is the tax on dividends and profits coming from financial applications, but also remuneration. This tax, this kind of income is basically reserved to the upper classes. If we reinstated this at a rate of 15%, it would increase government revenues at 190 billion reais. And that is more than twice the Bolsa Família program and more than the deficit plan for foreseen for this year. So this is also another important aspect, the reform of the tax system. And tax evasion as well, which is current estimation is around 500 billion a year in Brazil. And also you have all those programs of forgiveness, yes, of tax. Now Bolsa Evasão. Heading towards our last set of questions and discussions, I would like to screen the video that was kindly recorded by Denise. And Denise talks in this video, it's a very short video, about how civil society, how the NGO community is monitoring the effects of the new fiscal regime. As pointed to Fernanda, and also I was talking to Gabriel before this debate, it's still a very recent measure. So I mean, to assess its impacts, it will require more time. This is obvious. And then I'd like to come back to you after the video, Gabriel, to explain a little bit, I mean, how this should be done, the monitoring of the impacts. And also, Fernanda just pointed that we have to go back 2 years ago also to other austerity measures. So it's complex. So Denise will be talking about an initiative from this Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights platform. She's the special rapporteur on what they are doing, the missions that they are conducting right now, looking at different regions in Brazil and policies and what they are finding. So I'm going to present it to you.
Olá a todas, olá a todos. Meu nome é Denise Carreira. Eu integro a Organização de Educação Popular e Direitos Humanos, Ação Educativa, e sou também relatora nacional de direitos humanos da plataforma DESCA. A plataforma é uma rede de direitos humanos com mais de 40 organizações, movimentos, a Conectas integra essa rede também. Eu quero cumprimentar, parabenizar a Conectas pela realização do colóquio. Mais do que nunca é fundamental os ativistas de direitos humanos estarmos juntos, juntas, para pensar, para discutir, para construir estratégias e semear esperança num contexto tão difícil como esse que a gente está vivendo. Eu quero também aqui cumprimentar o relator da ONU, Philip Alston. Quero parabenizá-lo pelos posicionamentos contundentes, pelos posicionamentos firmes e críticos às políticas de austeridade no mundo e no Brasil. Seus posicionamentos têm sido fundamentais na nossa luta de questionamento a essas políticas e aos impactos que elas geram em termos de violação dos direitos humanos. Eu quero compartilhar com vocês uma iniciativa da plataforma Desca, que é a realização de uma missão especial sobre os impactos da política econômica de austeridade nos direitos humanos. Desde abril deste ano, a plataforma Desca vem realizando essa missão, envolvendo um conjunto de entidades, grupos de economistas, juristas e diversos parceiros que estão aliados no desenvolvimento dessa missão. Essa missão ela visa verificar como as políticas de austeridade estão chegando lá na ponta, lá nas comunidades, na vida concreta das famílias, nos corpos das pessoas, na população. Essa missão ela terá o resultado, o seu relatório com os principais resultados será apresentado agora no Senado Federal, no dia 4 de outubro, véspera de aniversário da nossa Constituição. Então tem todo um significado a divulgação desse relatório na véspera da promulgação da Constituição. E essa missão especial, ela envolveu a realização de 5 missões locais, justamente nessa perspectiva de verificar, de ouvir, de conversar com as pessoas e tentar identificar justamente esses impactos na ponta. Foram 5 missões, uma em Goiás, com foco na política de agricultura familiar, na verdade no desmonte dessa política de agricultura familiar no Brasil, e também o aumento da violência no campo, que também vem chegando a níveis terríveis. Uma outra realidade que foi objeto da missão foi a tríplice epidemia na Grande Recife, também a descontinuidade do atendimento a famílias afetadas pela tríplice epidemia da dengue, chikungunya e zika. Uma outra situação, uma outra missão local realizada foi sobre o crescimento da violência nas favelas cariocas, principalmente a violência institucional. O quarto caso, a quarta missão local abordada foi na cidade de São Paulo, com foco na população em situação de rua e nas ocupações de moradia, sobretudo para verificar como o direito humano à cidade vem sendo negado e a perseguição que vem sofrendo a população em situação de rua e essas ocupações de moradia. E a última missão, ela buscou abordar o desmantelamento da política indigenista, da política da FUNAI, o fechamento de postos indígenas em todo o país. Então, esse relatório, que também é composto por um texto sobre economia, sobre alternativas econômicas, também uma discussão jurídica, esse relatório ele vai apresentar também um conjunto de recomendações ao Estado brasileiro, no sentido de exigir a revogação da emenda constitucional 95, emenda constitucional que congelou os gastos nas áreas sociais. Esse relatório também vai propor um mecanismo de debate público sobre a adoção de políticas de austeridade, ou seja, os estados não podem adotar uma política de austeridade sem que ela seja amplamente discutida com a população. Então, são um conjunto de ações que estão previstas, que visam politizar, ampliar a roda do debate sobre economia. Economia é um assunto de interesse público, economia, temos direito de opinar e é fundamental democratizar o debate econômico e mostrar a relação entre economia e direitos humanos. Então eu convido a todos a participar desse processo e visitar o site da plataforma Desca. Muito obrigada pela oportunidade.
To end our presentations, and also, of course, I'd like to open the floor to the audience for questions. We have little time. Gabriel and Andressa, so what's next now in terms of this constitutional amendment? What will happen in the coming years? When we're going to see the impacts of the new fiscal regime? How to monitor the evolution of social spending and any other spending, infrastructure, as you said, and even the spending on public servants. And I know that there are already requests for judicial review at the Supreme Court of this constitutional amendment. What will be, in your view, the most important and relevant legal aspects that should be discussed by our Supreme Court when reviewing the constitutionality of the new fiscal regime?
Just add to the question. I think it was maybe 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago that we had heard that Lewandowski had in the Supreme Court, they had authorized or voted for the revision of the health, whatever would impact health of the amendment. I don't know what's the state of that.
I'll start by this last point because it's very relevant. So we've been discussing at the university, and the public debate has been revolving around an important theme. So are budgets part of the fundamental rights system? So do fundamental rights depend on budgetary provisions? Our Constitution, of course, prohibits any amendment that affects, that tends to abolish fundamental rights. That's important. But what the university and other legal scholars have been discussing is whether budgets can be curtailed in order to affect fundamental rights, and if they do so, if that's an unconstitutional measure. There have been some different conclusions around this theme. Yeah, so there's a predominant interpretation, I would say, here among our professors at this university, that yes, there is the financial constitution, public finance are part of the constitution, and so they should correspond fundamental rights. That was the main idea. Our Supreme Court has given a very important decision a very short time ago. I think it's not more than 3 weeks or a month. Minister Lewandowski has decided that yes, if a constitutional amendment affects the way fundamental rights are financed, then they do affect fundamental rights, and they should be declared unconstitutional. So even a constitutional amendment could be declared unconstitutional if they have a negative impact on financing public rights. The case was a very specific matter. They were discussing healthcare services, and this decision still has to be confirmed by other ministers. It was an individual decision, a preliminary decision from Minister Lewandowski. So I don't know what the result of this decision will be when other ministers rule on that matter. But I can guess that other ministers have a different view, so it might have a different outcome. Let me see. The first question was, how can the effects of the constitutional amendment number 95 be assessed? We have some institutions that carry on constant analysis of impact of public policies. Yes, so we have inside the government the internal control systems, and we have outside the government our accounting courts, and they also perform audits on the performance of public policies. So they are the institutional equipment that can deal with that problem. I'm not sure they always do that on a satisfactory way. That's a relevant point. Even the bureaucracy is not always well prepared to assess impact. They are, especially on the human rights perspective, yes. But I would say this is the institutional body of this analysis. When it comes to the end of this year, we can have a new basis for the fixation of the expenditure cap for 2018, because it always fixed on an annual basis. So on 2018, we have a new limit, a new quantitative limit that will define how much can be spent on social programs, and on a year-to-year basis we can distinguish how different public policies have been affected by budget cuts. But let me add two important things. Budget cuts have been everywhere, and they're not only caused by the constitutional amendment. So government has been curtailed expenditures not only because of the constitutional caps, but they have been doing so because they have other fiscal targets. For example, we have a deficit target, which is a huge gap in the budget, around 140 billion reais. And in order to achieve this deficit target, other budget cuts have to be made. That's what in the United States I think you call impoundments in the budget. So they suspend public expenditures. Those suspensions are not directly connected to the constitutional cap. Those are independent cuts. So we have cuts from many different sources. And there's a second aspect I would have to highlight, which is there's a very important human right which is the right to a transparent government. Yeah? We should have sincere budget projections. We should have sincere and honest provisions and budget executions and information from the government. Well, since the new constitutional amendment introduces a limit to public expenditure that cannot always be observed, it may have some other alternatives of financing that are not transparent on the budget. For example, it leaves out public companies. Public companies are not included. Non-dependent public companies are not included in the cap, so they can have independent expenditures. We fear that government may transfer expenditures to public companies, which in the state level is a practice that has been going on for a long time in Brazil. And that way they don't have to show those expenditures on the budget, although they can be carried on by public companies. That means there's always the very negative alternative coming from parallel budgets, which had a very negative tradition in Brazil. They have been limited during the 90s and in the next decade, but they might be resurging from somewhere. And that might limit the possibility of analyzing the impact of budget cuts, because budget is not transparent.
So, what I might say about my concerns about the new fiscal regime for the future, I'm probably, as I'm a public finance professor, I'm quite afraid. I'm worried about how our spendings with interest is increasing, because for interest we don't have any limit, and this is we put Brazil in a different situation from other countries. The is yes, public debt is something acceptable as part of the economic policy of any country. But in Brazil, we have an additional problem. This is our interest rate is so high. It's so high. So it made our public debt increase increase very fast in a short period of time. And I'm really worried that even with this ceiling of public spending, how this increase of spendings of to pay the interest of our public debt is increasing in a way that we don't have any plan in how to control this. This is not included in the ceiling, and what we see is that each year is getting worse. For the next year, our spendings in to pay the public the interests are increasing very fast, and I don't know, I don't see any solution from the government about this. The only solution that they show is we have to cut what we call primary expenditures. That's the only solution that we see. But I think in the end of the day, this is not going to be enough. We cannot cut everything. We cannot cut all our expenditures in education, health. We have to control the whole budget, what include our financial expenditure, mainly our expenditure with payments of interest in Brazil. And for me, I'm very, as I said, I'm very worried how this is going to be solved by the government in the future. It's a key point for me. We cannot cut. We have a limit to cut our expenditure. Where we are going, I don't know. Yeah, but I'm afraid about that.
It's the agendas, the parallel agendas that are coming around. I'm sorry about being exiting a bit of the specific debate on the fiscal regime, but we're talking about privatizations, right? It's coming along with the momentum that we are living in the country at the moment, right? So when we talk about quality public education in the university level, and the ceilings, the transparent ceilings that prevent Black students, especially Black students, to achieve certain levels of education in the university level, because we are now lacking budget to promote affirmative action policies, legislation, and to allow them to remain in the university once they get to the university, because that budget is being cut. They not only have to struggle to get into the public university, but also to remain in the public university. I mean, let's just look at this room. We don't have one Black person here because we always speak English to be in this conversation. Who has the right to learn English before they have finished their school degree, their university degree? Very few, because of inequality, right? So, and a whole, all this debate. So there's many agendas that are really raising the concern, and we're not only talking about the school and university access, but there's a strong agenda of privatization coming along with that. Also, a strong agenda of the privatization of the health system. There is a lot of less investments proposed for the Sistema Único de Saúde, for the health universal system. It's going to be, even though it's guaranteed by the Constitution, those 15%, but we need more. We need to increase. We will have more people And when we look at the regional differences in our country, those who make less money, those who have lower income, they access more the public services. And when we look at the tax we pay, indirect taxation really favors those who make more. Because, and this is something that the report draws attention to, lower income people, they pay 32% of their income in indirect tax by consuming, by products that they buy for their living. Whereas those who have higher income only pay 21% in taxes. So this is really about widening the inequality we have between among the Brazilians in our society, and preventing those who need more protection from the state to fulfill their basic social rights. So this is something that we really that's the opportunity of binding and combining, learning about what we're discussing here and bringing this to a daily life experiences that are being very narrowed, and opportunities that of losing the whole generation that's coming around. We are thinking of proposing tax and fiscal capacity building for the kids that are occupying their schools, because they're the ones who are going to be very affected by what's going on at the moment. So they want to discuss, public education. Let's bring this debate to them as well. And it would be really nice to count on students that are willing and that are doing their PhDs and masters to come along and meet other youngsters that really need to engage to these fronts of struggles.
Fernanda spilling water and now knocking over. Are you nervous? No. We have some very remaining time. Just like, would you like to make any questions to the speakers? We have one. And anyone else? I can collect like 2 or 3 questions and then. No, let's start. Then Julia.
So I have more than one question, so I'll try to be very brief. My name is Julia. I work with Caio at Conectas. And first I would like to ask to Gabriel, going back to the debate about the obligatory spending. Some economists, for example, I've heard some Sola say that the Constitutional Amendment 95 forces us to make reforms that we all know we need to make, like respecting the ceiling for payment of public servants, reform on the pension system, and etc. And that if all those reforms fail, then the constitutional amendment saves us a security assurance. I'm opposed to that argument in principle because I think it holds social spending hostage to all these reforms. But my question is it going to be effective? Do you think that the constitutional amendment is going to force us to make those reforms? Then to Fernanda, I would like to ask, in the report you identify a number of tax reform issues that we should tackle. For example, like Caio was saying, taxing dividends. For example, reducing the percentage of consumption tax. Is there any movement of tax reform in this direction? Meaning, do we have any allies within Congress or within the executive branch that are trying to do that? And finally, Professor Alston, in the beginning you said that we could look at this debate either through the lens of classic civil and political rights or through the lens of economic social rights. There's a very vivid debate on the inter-American system on whether to go directly to economic, social, and cultural rights or use civil and political rights. My question is, strategically, do you think it makes a difference? Should we be worried on trying to affirm that, no, we're talking about socioeconomic rights directly, or is it more effective to go through the civil and political rights lens? What's your take on that?
Truly nobody wants to make any other questions? Because then okay, so then let's make this. I'd like you to respond to Julia's questions and then also make any final remarks you might have, please. And then we close the session. So should we start from that end to this end? Gabriel, then Professor Alston, and then Fernanda.
Thank you, Julia. some economists have been saying that the new amendment has made us conscious of the fact that we don't have enough money for everything. So the last years have been expanding public expenditures, and they have spoiled us. Yeah, they have given us the impression that we have money for everything. And new amendment has introduced a kind of sense, has returned us Brazilians to our good senses, that there's no money for every need. I doubt that for many reasons. First of all, because there are many expenditures that are really responsible for the increase in the total level of government spending that are not breached by the amendment. So Andressa mentioned public debt expenditures, but there are also many expenditures spent on a completely irrational public administration machinery. Money going for nowhere that will keep on going to senseless policies. Primary expenditures have been chosen as the villain, but actually they can have many positive effects, and they should not be chosen as the first target. I suspect that they are there included in the amendment because they are kind of easy to cut expenditures. Most of them, they can be adjusted very easily in the budget without having to address more significant problems of our budget, more structural problems of our budget. But the point is, even if those expenditures come to zero, which would be a very dangerous situation, of course, but if they do so, we cannot guarantee that this measure would control public expenditures, because most of them would still be out of control. So that's the irrationality of the constitutional amendment. It would depend on many other reforms, including social security and many others that I have already mentioned. And we have seen that those policies cannot be carried on satisfactorily by a highly unpopular government. So we know all political difficulties of the government. Yeah. So those are my concerns about the constitutional amendment. It can have many negative effects on important expenditures and no effect at all at our really dangerous expenditures. So that's the main characteristic of this constitutional measure. And I would thank you for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to be with you this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for the question. Yes, if I got it right, you asked how we are reacting, or what kind of movement we're engaging with in order to grow the movements against the unfair tax system of the country, and did I get it right? Yeah. Considering the asks and the figures that we bring in the report, there's one thing that we want to raise to help raising the awareness of the society, is that we're not against the rich or the people that are doing well in life, but we are targeting the super rich, which are being exempted by paying the proper share of what they make in order to improve everyone's life quality and welfare, and whatever you want to call it. So we're talking about people who are earning from 5,000 reais to 20,000 reais. They're the ones that pay the strongest amount, the strongest part of the revenue in tax in the country. So why don't we look at those who are making a lot more than that and are not paying the correct taxes because they count on lucros e dividendos? I don't know how to translate that. Profit and dividends. So this is something that's really, and it's relatively recent in our history. It comes from 95, I think. So yeah. So why that? So we are questioning that. We are also questioning the indirect taxation, and these will of course affect the majority of those who are who are middle class and lower classes in the country, and looking at direct taxation for those who have higher income, and also something that's in our constitution, but it's not being regulated yet, which is the tax for herança e grandes fortunas. It's in the constitution for when we inherit a fortune, that specific tax is not being regulated yet. Also over patrimonio, over ownership, over property, it's not quite well balanced either in the country. So those who have, the more you have, the less you pay, when it should be the opposite, right? So this is basically what we are discussing. And yes, there's a movement. There's been I think fighting the unfair tax system of Brazil is as difficult as fighting inequality. It looks like they're twins. They're organs of the same body when we're talking about, because it's a forever debate and struggle from social movements to tackle our unfair tax system. At the moment, there is a campaign. There's a joint initiative that gathers COFECON, que é o Conselho Nacional de Economia. It gathers unions, it gathers NGOs, Instituto de Justiça Fiscal, INESC, other, Oxfam is also in there. Other, they're getting together to write, and professors from Unicamp and from other universities coming together to study all of the proposals to reform our tax system, and to come up with a new one that could be nearly the ideal one. And in parallel to that, to do the advocacy work that we have to do in approaching all the congressmen and women and discuss this and that. And we have to study what's their position in voting the previous proposals that have been voted. So it's a whole lot of work. But we have to take the opportunities, because they are voting things so fast that if there's an opportunity, we must have a proposal that is at least good enough to try to bring it forward, which at the current political situation, we don't think it's favorable. I mean, we don't see this optimistically. But since they're just voting things just like that, we must be quick too. So this is what's happening at the moment, and we can provide you more information on the campaign and on what's been done so far. I think at this very moment, we are in the text of trying to write this with a group of specialists. And the challenge is to bring this out of the group of the specialists and making this available and open to more participation and to more awareness of other groups that could make good pressure on the Congress for that. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Caio. Thank you for being here. As I said in the beginning, we are learning a lot by doing this work and with this activism, and it was really good for me to be with you. I hope that we can be together in other fronts in the very near future.
I just want to thank you very much for the invitation. And when Fernanda was talking, I was remembering a number that Piketty, who was this week in Brazil, mentioned about our country, that we have 6 Brazilians who have the same wealth of 100 million people. So it's a lot of difference, that we have a serious problem that we have to face, for sure. And I think this seminar is a step on this, to achieve, to at least to think the problem and how to try to solve this whole difference of level of wealth in Brazil. And thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between tax and other forms of government, fiscal policy, and inequality is very direct. If you look at the great wealth accumulated by many families, you'll find that there are specific provisions of public policy that have enabled and facilitated that. So I think we do need to look at them together. Just a couple of other quick comments. One, the Brazilian strategy that's been described resembles what Paul Krugman, a Nobel economist, but who now occupies a much more important role, which is that of weekly columnist in the New York Times, writing on current economic and other developments, political developments. Krugman has long described Republican strategy as to starve the beast, by which he means the beast is the Leviathan that eats up all of the public resources in order to support social protection and so on. And so the strategy essentially of cutting taxes is to starve that beast, thereby justifying Republicans saying, well, we can't afford this level of health care or this level of Medicare or of pensions or whatever. So that's the strategy, and I think that's what's being played out here. The question that Julia asked, I think, raises a very important point, because the real human rights perspective on what we've been talking about is that we need to put certain values at the center of the debate. And the values that have been put there are fiscal prudence, fiscal sustainability, investment attraction, etc. These are actually seen as values implicitly in the debate. The values of human rights are not there. The value of providing social protection, that sort of social contract that we should have as a citizen or a resident of a country, the government is obligated to ensure basic minimal standard of living for all of us. That is a human rights notion. It's not present in most of these debates. It needs to be brought in, otherwise the debate is really totally one-sided. You asked a specific question which goes to the strategy and goes to this well-known debate. There are those in the inter-American human rights system who say, well, social rights are not really in the American Convention. They're just mentioned in passing in one provision, Article 26. And therefore, even if we want to promote them, we shouldn't talk about them. We should instead go through essentially the non-discrimination provisions, which we are all familiar with. And there are others who say that's a complete sellout, etc. I think there's no question in my mind that we need both strategies. There are many audiences that won't be impressed by social rights. It's really in part why I gave the example before. If there is a 54% cut in public security, that's going to affect people who don't give a damn about social protection, but who are conscious of the fact that they might want to walk on the street at night after 6 o'clock at night without being attacked, and will therefore see that cut as a major assault on the rights that they value. But at the same time, if that's all we are doing, if we are reducing social rights to non-discrimination, where there are no social rights, where we're not providing housing, where we're not providing a decent Bolsa Familia allowance or whatever, then non-discrimination doesn't get us anywhere. So it's not an adequate strategy on its own. And thanks for the opportunity to be here, particularly to Conectas and Caio for having organized this.
I have to thank you on behalf of Conectas for the generosity of all of you. A special thanks, of course, to Professor Alston for coming to participate in the colloquium and being here, and to Gabriel for having arranged this space for us at the law school, and also for being here as a debater. Thank you very much Fernanda, Sandra, and also for you, I know that, as we said in the beginning, there is an event going on corruption. It's it's a very attractive topic as well. So thank you for being here. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of Ana Paula from the regional office of the UN High Commissioner. The UN High Commissioner has been very vocal also about the developments of this country, yes, calling the attention of our authorities to the obligations that we have abide by regarding international human rights. So thank you very much. With that, I close the session.